My name is Anna Miller, and I am 26 years old. I never thought that a family dinner in Cedar Falls, Ohio would become the night I learned just how far my parents were willing to go to protect my brother. Daniel is 29. The golden child of the Miller family, the son who was destined to inherit everything, the one who could do no wrong. I was the other one, the daughter who worked hard as a nurse but never quite shined enough to get their admiration. That night, in the middle of laughter, expensive wine, and the pretense of a perfect family gathering, Daniel shoved me so hard that my ribs cracked against the corner of the heavy oak table. The sound, that dreadful pop, is etched into my memory as clearly as my mother's whisper. She leaned close, her perfume sweet and suffocating, and said softly, so only I could hear, "Stay quiet, Anna, he has a future." The pain was like nothing I had ever felt. Each breath was sharp like knives pressing into my chest, but the words my mother spoke cut deeper than the injury. She was not concerned about whether I could breathe or if I needed a hospital. She cared about Daniel's reputation, about the image of our family in the town, where appearances meant everything. For a moment, I thought I would collapse right there and be left on the floor as part of another secret they would lock away behind their polished smiles. But fate played a different card that night. Our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door for more than 30 years, had heard the shouting through her window. She had become accustomed to loud celebrations at our house, but the crash and the cry that followed were different. Concerned, she checked the feed from her front door camera. The small device mounted above her porch caught the exact moment Daniel's voice rose in fury, caught the sound of my body hitting the table, and caught the image of me clutching my side as my breath faltered. Without hesitation, she dialed 911. Within minutes, Officer Miguel Reyes arrived at our front door. He was young, but carried the weight of authority in his stance, the kind of officer who knew the difference between noise and danger. My father tried to block the doorway with polite but firm words, saying it was only a family misunderstanding, but Reyes insisted on stepping inside. Mrs. Jenkins had already forwarded the footage to the police dispatcher, so when Reyes entered our dining room, he knew he was not walking into a misunderstanding. He was walking into a crime scene. I sat hunched in the chair, one hand pressed against my ribs, trying to steady my breathing. Daniel stood nearby, glass of whiskey still in his hand, his eyes flashing with annoyance rather than concern. My mother hovered behind me, one hand on my shoulder, but her face tight with fear. Not fear for my health, but fear of what would happen if the truth got out. My father attempted charm, insisting that everything was under control. But Officer Reyes's eyes moved from me to Daniel and back again, measuring the room, absorbing the silence that followed every denial. This was the moment when I realized the balance of power could shift. All my life, the Miller family name had been enough to silence teachers, neighbors, even distant relatives. People wanted to believe the Miller family was perfect because it fit the picture Cedar Falls loved to paint of itself. But Reyes did not grow up under my father's influence. He did not care about the garden club or the construction company's sponsorship of Little League. He had video evidence in his hands, and he had the sight of a young woman wincing with every breath. He did not blink. He did not smile politely, and he did not turn away. I wish I could tell you that I stood up immediately and demanded justice, but that would be a lie. The truth is, I was terrified of Daniel's temper, of my parents' disappointment, of the storm that would erupt if I confirmed what Reyes already suspected. Yet even in that fear, a flicker of relief burned. Someone else had witnessed it. Someone else had called for help. For the first time, it was not just my word against my family's version of events. As the officer asked me if I needed medical attention, I hesitated. My father interrupted, saying she will be fine, she just tripped. My mother nodded quickly, her nails pressing into my shoulder. But Reyes held up a hand and repeated the question to me directly. I opened my mouth, and though my voice was weak, the words came out. I need help. That was the start of everything that followed. The betrayal, the denial, the desperate attempts to keep me silent, and the long road towards standing in my own truth. I had lived my entire life in Cedar Falls, a town of 15,000, where everyone knew each other's names and every family's reputation was a currency. I knew what my parents feared. They feared that if I spoke, if I admitted what Daniel had done, the Miller name would no longer be untouchable. They feared whispers in church pews, lost contracts, and invitations rescinded. but I had reached a point where my silence was more unbearable than their wrath. As I sat in that chair with my ribs throbbing and my family spinning their narrative around me, I realized that my life was no longer just about preserving appearances. It was about survival. And survival sometimes begins the moment you stop whispering and start telling the truth. Cedar Falls was the kind of Midwestern town that looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, quiet streets lined with maples, church bells every Sunday morning, and the same families showing up in the local newspaper year after year for their donations and community service. My family, the Millers, was one of those families. People in town looked at us and saw stability, success, and tradition. What they could not see was the hierarchy carved deep into the walls of our home. My father, Richard, owned a successful construction company, the kind that built entire neighborhoods and sponsored every major event in town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and commanded every room he entered. People respected him, or at least they feared crossing him. My mother, Elaine, was the picture of refinement. She organized charity luncheons, presided over the garden club, and always managed to look flawless even when the world was crumbling behind closed doors. To neighbors, she was warmth and sophistication. To me, she was a woman who valued image above her daughter's bruises. Daniel, my older brother, was the star. From the time we were children, it was clear that he was the one they pinned their dreams on. When he smashed a toy truck into my porcelain doll, the response was always, "Boys will be boys." When he threw a tantrum in the middle of a school play, my parents laughed it off and told everyone Daniel just had a strong personality. Every failure of his was spun into a story of resilience, while every success of mine was treated as routine. I remember when I brought home a report card with straight A's. My parents nodded and told me good job before moving on. When Daniel scraped by with a C in math after nearly failing, they took us all out to dinner at the nicest steakhouse in town to celebrate his improvement. It was like watching the scales of fairness tip in his direction over and over until I stopped hoping they would balance. Our grandmother once gave me a piano, an old upright she had restored, because she saw how much I loved music. I practiced every day after school. One afternoon, Daniel stormed in angry about losing a game with his friends and slammed the cover down so hard the keys cracked. I cried for hours. My father bought me a replacement keyboard but told me not to provoke Daniel when he was in a mood. That moment stayed with me, the perfect example of how my parents would rather fix an object than address the behavior that destroyed it. As we grew older, the division only sharpened. Daniel was the heir groomed to take over the business. I was told to pick something respectable that would not embarrass the family. Writing had been my passion. I filled journals with stories, poems, and thoughts about the world. My high school English teacher encouraged me to apply to creative writing programs, but my father laughed. "Writing is a hobby, Anna, not a career. You will study something practical." My mother agreed, nodding as though practicality was the highest virtue. I chose nursing because it combined my love for helping people with a career they could boast about at parties. When people asked about their daughter, they could say proudly that she was a nurse. It was not art, but it was respectable enough to maintain the family image. I did not realize at the time that every choice I made was bent around their expectations like a tree growing toward a stake hammered in the ground. I wanted to believe my parents loved me in their way, and sometimes I think they did, but it was always a love filtered through the lens of Daniel's shadow. If he succeeded, they glowed with pride. If he failed, they searched for excuses. If I succeeded, they shrugged. If I stumbled, they scolded me for not being more like him. To outsiders, the Millers were the ideal American family. We sent out glossy Christmas cards every year with color-coordinated outfits. My father sponsored baseball teams and had his picture in the paper cutting ribbons at new housing developments. My mother threw galas that raised thousands for the local hospital. Our house was a sprawling colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch. It looked like the kind of home where laughter and love filled every corner. Inside, though, silence and tension ruled. There were rules you did not break. You did not contradict my father. You did not embarrass my mother. You did not expose Daniel. I internalized those rules so deeply that even as an adult I still heard them echoing in my mind. Cedar Falls rewarded families who looked good. Reputation was currency, and my parents spent every ounce of energy maintaining theirs. Whenever I tried to talk about how Daniel treated me, I was told not to air dirty laundry. When I hinted to friends about feeling left out, I was reminded of how lucky I was to have a successful family. The image of perfection was more important than the reality of pain. That was the family I belonged to, a family where Daniel's temper was explained away as passion, where his cruelty was disguised as ambition, where his violence was minimized as accidents. A family where my place was to endure quietly so the facade could remain unbroken. From my earliest years, the pattern was set in stone, and though I tried to ignore it, I could not escape how different Daniel and I were treated. He was 3 years older and bigger, and he always made sure I knew it. When we were children, he would take toys out of my hands just to prove he could, and if I complained, my mother would smile tightly and say, "He is just teasing Anna, do not be so sensitive." That phrase became the soundtrack of my childhood, a steady reminder that my feelings did not matter as much as his impulses. I remember one spring afternoon in elementary school when the neighborhood kids gathered in our backyard for a game of tag. I was fast and nimble, and for once I managed to beat Daniel, tagging him before he could escape. He turned red with fury and shoved me so hard that I fell onto the gravel, scraping both my palms until they bled. I cried as the grit embedded itself into my skin, but when my parents came out to see what had happened, they waved it off as harmless competition. "Boys are rough," my father said, "you will toughen up." Later that evening, while I tried to wash out the cuts, Daniel strutted around the living room, telling everyone how he had let me win once out of pity. The sting of the peroxide on my skin was nothing compared to the sting of being invisible. There were other incidents, countless small moments that piled up into a mountain of proof. Once, he locked me in the basement for nearly an hour because I had told him not to borrow my school supplies without asking. When I finally got free and told our mother, she laughed lightly and said I needed to develop thicker skin, that siblings did these things, and one day I would laugh about it too. But I never laughed. I carried those memories like hidden bruises. As the years passed, Daniel's dominance shifted from physical pranks to cutting words. He called me names, mocked my appearance, ridiculed my interests. When I shared a poem I had written in middle school, he told me it was childish and boring, and when my father overheard, he chuckled in agreement and said perhaps medicine or law would be a better use of my time. That night, I tucked my notebook under my pillow and decided never to show them my writing again. Gaslighting was a daily ritual. If I complained that Daniel had taken something from my room, he would insist I had misplaced it. If I said he hurt me, my parents would scold me for exaggerating. Soon, I began to doubt my own memory, wondering if I truly was too sensitive, too dramatic, too weak. My father reinforced that doubt whenever I tried to stand up for myself. He would sigh and say, "Anna, your brother will run this company one day. He cannot have distractions. You need to support him." I would nod, swallowing my resentment like medicine I had no choice but to take. The one refuge I had was my writing. In notebooks hidden at the bottom of my closet, I poured out stories and reflections, creating a world where I mattered, where someone cared enough to listen. My English teacher, Mrs. Collins, noticed my talent and encouraged me to apply to writing programs. She said my words had power, that they deserved to be heard. For a brief moment, I believed her. I imagined myself in a city far from Cedar Falls, studying literature, surrounded by people who valued creativity. When I told my parents, my father laughed. "Writers starve. He said you need a career that will keep you secure and make us proud." My mother agreed immediately, saying practicality was more important than dreams. Daniel smirked from across the table, enjoying the way my shoulders sagged. Eventually, I surrendered. I put the notebooks away and told myself nursing was a compromise, a path where at least I could help others, even if I could not feed my own soul. Every bruise, every insult, every dismissal was covered with the same bandage of excuses. "He is under pressure. He has a temper. He does not mean it. You are too dramatic." By the time I was a teenager, I had internalized those excuses so deeply that I barely trusted my own emotions. Whenever I felt anger or sadness, a voice inside whispered, "You are overreacting. Keep quiet." That voice was not mine. It was my mother's, implanted in me like a seed that grew into silence. Looking back now, I see how carefully the roles were constructed. Daniel, the golden child, destined for greatness, excused for every cruelty. Me, the scapegoat, expected to absorb the pain and still smile for the family photos. It was not a childhood of equal love, but a system designed to elevate one and diminish the other. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together they created a foundation of imbalance and fear. And on top of that foundation, my parents built the image of the perfect family, plastering over the cracks with holiday cards, community awards, and polite smiles. I lived in two worlds, the glossy surface everyone admired and the bruised undercurrent no one wanted to see. I learned early how to pretend, how to hold my tongue, how to smile when I wanted to cry. That training would follow me into adulthood, shaping the choices I made, the risks I avoided, and the silence I kept for far too long. After finishing nursing school in Columbus and working there for a few years, I thought I had carved out some distance from the toxic patterns of my family. The city gave me air to breathe, patients who valued my care colleagues, who respected me, and the quiet dignity of being able to stand on my own 2 feet. Yet even in that independence, there was an ache, the hope that maybe someday my parents would look at me and see someone worth celebrating. When an opening came up at the Cedar Falls Community Hospital, I hesitated. It was practical, the pay was solid, and the hospital offered student loan forgiveness, which felt like a gift after years of debt. More than that, part of me wanted to test if things could change now that I was grown, now that I had a career with a title my parents could mention at their charity luncheons. I convinced myself that returning home was an act of maturity, a chance to reset the relationship. The first weeks back were filled with polite welcomes. Neighbors dropped off casseroles, church friends hugged me in the pews, and my parents introduced me as our daughter Anna, the nurse. There was pride in their voices, but it felt rehearsed, as if they were reading lines from a script. Daniel was still the center of every conversation. He had been promoted within my father's construction company, now running a major development project. His photo had appeared in the local paper, shaking hands with the mayor. At the dinner table, his stories dominated while mine were brushed aside. One evening, I tried to share about a complicated case at the hospital, how a patient had trusted me to sit with her through a difficult diagnosis. My mother interrupted to ask if I had met any suitable young men in Columbus. My father shifted the conversation back to Daniel's new project on the riverfront. I smiled politely and folded my words back into silence, reminding myself not to expect too much. Then came the night of the celebration, a dinner organized to honor Daniel's new role as project director. My mother spent days planning the menu, hanging banners that read "Congratulations" and arranging flowers in Daniel's favorite colors. I offered to help in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and setting the table, hoping that contributing would make me feel part of the joy rather than just a spectator. I even bought a bottle of expensive wine, stretching my budget, wanting to show I cared. At first, the evening was warm. My father opened the wine, my mother served beef roast, and the conversation flowed easily. Daniel soaked in the praise, laughing, boasting a little, but still within the bounds of civility. I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe adulthood had leveled the playing field. But as the glasses refilled and the whiskey came out, Daniel's tone shifted. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glassy with drink, and smirked at me across the table. "So Anna's still wiping noses and fetching water for the real doctors." His words landed like stones. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but he pressed on. "Nursing is a nice job if you don't have the brains for anything bigger." My mother chuckled softly as if he were making a harmless joke. My father sipped his drink without meeting my eyes. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to respond calmly. "Being a nurse takes skill and compassion, Daniel. It is not just fetching water." He raised his glass and sneered. "Compassion does not pay the bills. Building houses does." The table laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than confronting him. Heat rushed to my face, the same old humiliation replayed in adult form. I swallowed hard and reminded myself I had chosen this profession for me, not for their approval. Still, the sting of being belittled by my own brother in front of my parents was almost unbearable. I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending to refill dishes, trying to catch my breath. Through the doorway, I heard my father lift his glass and toast to Daniel, following in my footsteps, securing the future of Miller Construction. The clink of crystal echoed like a verdict. No matter how old we grew, no matter what I achieved, Daniel was the heir and I was the shadow. When I returned to the table, Daniel was on his third whiskey. His girlfriend Megan had been mentioned in passing, and when I offered a kind word about her saying she seemed lovely and had invited me to her family's lake house, Daniel's expression hardened. His voice sharpened as he accused me of interfering, of talking to his girlfriend behind his back, of trying to dig for weaknesses. I was stunned. My words had been casual, friendly, but in his intoxicated mind, they were an attack. The atmosphere thickened, tension rising like a storm cloud. My mother fiddled with her napkin, my father cleared his throat, but no one challenged him. I felt the same helplessness I had known as a child, the sense that no matter what I said, it would be twisted, minimized, or used against me. The first wave of emotional undulation hit hard. I had returned hoping for recognition, maybe even healing, and within a few hours I was back in the old role, mocked, dismissed, and accused. I tried to hold my ground, but my voice shook as I said I was only being kind. Daniel slammed his glass down so hard, whiskey spilled across the tablecloth. "Always so perfect, Anna," he snarled, "always trying to make me look bad." The room went silent, except for my racing heart. In that moment, I knew the evening was spiraling, that the mask of family harmony was slipping, and that something darker was about to emerge. The tension that hung in the dining room felt like a storm about to break. My father tried to calm Daniel, his voice steady but edged with unease, reminding him that this was supposed to be a night of celebration. My mother suggested we move on to dessert, her smile brittle, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered plates. But Daniel's focus was fixed on me. He pushed back his chair with a screech that cut through the air and staggered into the kitchen. After a moment of silence, I followed, hoping to diffuse the situation, hoping that maybe a quiet word would ease his temper. The kitchen smelled of roast beef and wine, the counters cluttered with half-finished dishes, but all I could see was Daniel pouring another glass of whiskey, his hand unsteady, his eyes burning. "I am sorry if I upset you," I said, carefully setting a stack of plates on the counter. "That was not my intention." He turned slowly, glass in hand, and sneered. "You always do this, Anna, acting innocent while you undermine me." My chest tightened. I shook my head. "I was not undermining you. I like Megan. I was only being polite." He stepped closer, the reek of alcohol on his breath. "Do not talk to her about my family. Do not talk to anyone about us. You have always been jealous. You cannot stand that I am successful, and you are just a nurse still paying off loans." His words sliced deeper than the whiskey fumes, not because they were true, but because they were a complete inversion of reality. For a moment, I almost laughed at the absurdity, and that laugh was the spark. His face contorted with rage. "Do not laugh at me." Before I could move, he shoved me with both hands. My body slammed into the sharp edge of the granite counter. The sound was sickening, a crack that echoed in my ribs, followed by an explosion of pain so fierce I could not draw breath. I crumpled to the floor, clutching my side, gasping as if drowning on dry land. The room spun spots of light, dancing in my vision. My mother's scream pierced the air as she rushed in my father right behind her, his face drained of color. "What happened?" she cried, looking between us with frantic eyes. "She fell." Daniel snapped instantly. "She tripped." I tried to speak, but the agony made every word jagged. "He pushed me." I managed my voice, barely more than a whisper. The look on my mother's face flickered from concern to calculation. "I am sure it was an accident," she said, kneeling beside me, her hand hovering but not touching. "Daniel would not deliberately hurt you, but he had, and the truth of it throbbed with every shallow breath." My father's jaw tightened. "You will be fine," he said. "Take some ibuprofen. Rest. Tomorrow you will feel better." I shook my head, the pain so severe it felt like knives twisting inside my chest. "I need a hospital, please." My father stepped forward, his voice firm. "Let us not overreact. Broken ribs or not, the treatment is the same. Rest and painkillers. There is no need to involve anyone else." I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face, and realized this was not about my health. It was about silence. It was about keeping the Miller name clean. But fate had already intervened. Outside, through the thin curtains of the kitchen window, Mrs. Jenkins's doorbell camera had captured the muffled sounds of the altercation, the crash, and my cry of pain. She had watched in horror, recognized the severity, and sent the footage directly to the police dispatcher along with her call. The timestamp was clear, the images undeniable. At that very moment, the video was already stored in police files. My parents did not know it yet, but their attempts to contain the damage would crumble against those pixels of truth. On the kitchen floor, clutching my side, I felt the full weight of their betrayal. The boy who had tormented me all my life had grown into a man whose violence was no longer confined to childhood games. The parents who should have protected me were already crafting a story to protect him instead. My body screamed for medical attention, but my heart screamed louder at the realization that their loyalty would never be mine. I struggled to my feet with my mother's reluctant help, every movement sending agony through my chest. My father kept repeating family disagreements happen, no need to exaggerate. Daniel stood with arms crossed, his smirk returning as he saw me weaken. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The pain was unbearable, the betrayal sharper than glass, but beneath it all, a small flame flickered. The flame of knowing that someone else had heard someone else, had seen someone else, had acted. Mrs. Jenkins had not looked away. She had done what my own family refused to do, and the police were already on their way. The hours after the incident blurred into a haze of pain and pressure. My mother pressed a cold cloth to my forehead as if tending to a fever rather than fractured bones, her whispers frantic, telling me not to dramatize, not to make a scene. My father stood near the kitchen door, speaking in clipped tones about how this was a private matter, a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with time. Daniel retreated to the living room, the sound of his heavy footsteps and the clink of another glass of whiskey seeping through the walls. I could hardly breathe without pain, but their words suffocated me more than my ribs ever could. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I reached for it, but my mother snatched it away with a tight smile. "No calls tonight, Anna. We need to keep this in the family." Her eyes were wide, the same eyes that had looked at me my whole life, with that mixture of love and calculation, always weighing what was best for the family image rather than what was right for me. Later that night, she brought a gift basket into my room, as if expensive chocolates and scented candles could replace medical treatment. She whispered that Daniel felt terrible, that I should forgive and forget, that one day when he was running the company, I would understand why it mattered so much to protect him. My father was less delicate. He came to me the next morning with his jaw tight and his voice low. "You will not go to a doctor. Do you understand?" He said ribs heal on their own, and no one needed to know what happened. He reminded me of the trust fund they controlled, of the financial support they still provided for my student loans, of the influence they could wield in this small town to make my life either smooth or unbearable. The message was clear: stay silent or lose everything. Daniel's call came later, his voice thick with arrogance even through the phone. "You are not really hurt," he said. "You probably just bruised yourself when you fell. If you tell anyone, you will regret it." My hand shook as I held the phone, not just from pain, but from fury. He had shoved me. He had heard the crack of bone, and still he spun the story into my fault, my imagination, my burden to carry. Alone in my room that evening, the curtains drawn, the pain throbbing with every shallow breath, I felt the walls closing in. The house was too quiet except for the occasional creak of Daniel moving around upstairs and the muffled murmur of my parents in the kitchen. I sat in the dark, clutching my side tears sliding down my face, wondering how many times I had been in this position before. Silenced, dismissed, invisible. Only this time, my body bore the proof, every breath a reminder that their version of reality was not the truth. Just when I thought I could not sink further into despair, the doorbell rang, a sharp sound insistent echoing through the quiet house. My father went to answer it, and moments later I heard a firm voice. "Officer Reyes." The name alone sent a shiver of both fear and relief through me. He had returned not by chance, but because someone had given him reason. In the silence of my room, I realized Mrs. Jenkins must have shared her footage. The video that captured the sounds, the shove, the aftermath, all time-stamped and undeniable. My father's voice grew strained, insisting everything was fine, that it was too late for visitors, but Reyes was persistent. "I need to speak with Anna directly," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My mother rushed into my room before the officer could reach me, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Please, Anna, remember what I said. Think about Daniel's future. Think about the family." She was still begging when the door opened and Reyes stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, landing on me hunched in pain, clutching my side. He did not flinch. He did not defer to my parents' rehearsed charm. He asked me directly how I was feeling and whether I needed medical attention. In that moment, the weight of decades pressed down on me, the reflex to minimize, to deny, to protect Daniel. But the throbbing in my ribs and the certainty in Reyes's gaze cracked that reflex wide open. "I need help," I whispered again, louder this time, clearer. My parents froze their silence, thick with disbelief. Reyes nodded once pulled out his notepad and began to write. For the first time in my life, someone in authority had heard me, had believed me, and was not willing to look away. The presence of Officer Reyes shifted the atmosphere instantly, as if the walls themselves recognized that the Miller facade was cracking. He motioned for me to sit still while he called for EMT backup, his calm authority cutting through the anxious muttering of my parents. My father tried to interject, saying it was unnecessary, that I would be fine with some rest, but Reyes silenced him with a look. The sound of the dispatcher's voice on his radio filled the room, confirming that an ambulance was en route. My mother wrung her hands, whispering that this was humiliating, that neighbors would talk if flashing lights pulled up outside. But Reyes was unyielding. "Ma'am," he said, "the neighbors already know something happened. What matters now is that your daughter gets care." When the EMTs arrived, they treated me with professional efficiency, slipping an oxygen mask over my face, gently probing my ribs, and lifting me carefully onto a stretcher. Each movement sent waves of agony through my body, but also waves of relief, because finally someone was acknowledging the injury instead of pretending it was imaginary. My parents trailed behind whispering excuses, while Daniel stood in the doorway with a sullen glare, arms crossed, watching me leave. As they wheeled me toward the ambulance, Reyes asked if I wanted to file a statement. My mother jumped in before I could answer. Her voice, brittle. "She tripped in the kitchen. It was an accident." Reyes turned back to me. "Anna, I need to hear from you, not them." My lips trembled, but I forced myself to speak. He pushed me. I said the words raw and painful, but liberating. The officer wrote it down, his pen scratching across the notepad like the sound of truth taking form. At the hospital, the X-rays confirmed 3 fractured ribs, one dangerously displaced. The doctor explained the risks of a punctured lung, the need for close monitoring. I nodded numbly, trying to absorb the clinical details, while my mind replayed my mother's whisper. "Stay quiet, he has a future." The words seemed grotesque now in the fluorescent light of the emergency room. Daniel's future had been her priority, not my ability to breathe. Officer Reyes appeared at my bedside later that night. He held a small tablet showing me the footage from Mrs. Jenkins's camera. The grainy image was clear enough. Daniel's body language aggressive, my figure collapsing, the timestamp undeniable. "This," he said, "is strong evidence. Your neighbor has already given us the file." My throat tightened with gratitude and fear. Gratitude that someone had cared enough to act fear of what my family would do when they realized the truth was out of their control. My mother arrived soon after, her face pale, but her voice sharp. She begged me to tell the police it had been an accident, her words spilling over each other. She said Daniel's career would be destroyed, that the company would suffer, that gossip would tear us apart. But when she tried to dismiss the footage as misleading, Reyes cut her off. "Cameras do not lie, Mrs. Miller." He turned back to me. "You are not alone, Anna. You have the right to tell your story and to be protected." Tears filled my eyes. For the first time, I felt the heavy cloak of silence slipping from my shoulders. The next day, the police formally opened a case. Reyes filed his report. The hospital submitted medical records, and the video was logged as primary evidence. The Miller family's reputation, carefully burnished for decades, was now under scrutiny. My father stormed into the hospital room, his words clipped and furious. "You are destroying us, Anna. Do you understand what you are doing?" I looked at him, the man who had built houses but never built a safe home for his daughter, and I felt a strange calm. "I am telling the truth," I said. If that destroys you, that is not my fault." He glared, but could not refute me. Reyes stood nearby, watching, ensuring I was not intimidated into silence. My father left without another word, the echo of his anger lingering like smoke. That night, alone in my hospital bed, I thought about all the years I had swallowed my pain, all the moments I had chosen silence, because I thought it was easier all the times I believed my parents' version of reality instead of my own. Now, the truth had been recorded, preserved, and presented by someone outside the family's control. The cycle of gaslighting had been broken not by me at first, but by a neighbor who refused to ignore the signs. That realization gave me strength. I was not powerless. I had allies, and for the first time in my life, the truth was louder than the lies. The days following the hospital visit unfolded like a storm gathering strength. The medical staff confirmed what I already knew: 3 broken ribs, 1 dangerously displaced, and a recovery that would take weeks of careful rest. I was placed on medical leave from the hospital, a relief on one hand, but also a burden because it left me alone with my thoughts. Officer Reyes visited to collect further statements, and each time his presence reassured me that someone outside my family believed me. Yet every moment of calm was followed by another surge of chaos from the Millers. My parents began calling incessantly, alternating between pleading and threatening. My mother's voice would tremble with tears as she begged me to reconsider, to think about Daniel's future, to keep the family intact. My father's tone was harsher, filled with cold anger, warning me that the company could collapse under scandal, that I was being selfish, that I would regret ruining everything they had built. Daniel himself was worse. He sent me texts dripping with venom, insisting I was lying, accusing me of being jealous, warning me that he would make sure everyone in Cedar Falls knew I was unstable. When I did not respond, he began posting vague comments on social media about traitors and attention seekers. Friends from high school messaged me asking what was going on, and I could feel the tide of public opinion shifting even before the case went to court. At work, the whispers began. Colleagues glanced at me with pity or suspicion, unsure whether to believe my story or Daniel's charm. He had already visited job sites and spoken loudly about his sister, inventing tales to bring him down. The weight of his smear campaign pressed on me from every angle. One evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to breathe through the ache in my ribs, my best friend Karen knocked on the door. She was a fellow nurse, someone who had always believed in me. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my injuries, and then held my shoulders. "Anna," she said firmly, "if you were my patient, I would never let you stay silent. You deserve the same care you give everyone else. You have to fight this not just for justice, but for yourself." Her words broke through the fog of doubt my family had been trying to wrap around me. Still, the fear was real. Daniel was powerful in our town, shielded by my parents' wealth and influence. Part of me wondered if telling the truth was enough, if the system would protect him the way my family always had. The night after Karen's visit, I received a letter slipped under my door. It was from my parents' attorney. The paper was crisp and formal, the words cold. If I did not retract my statement within 48 hours, they would cut off financial support, remove me from the family trust, and disown me publicly. Reading those lines, I felt a mix of dread and clarity. Their love had always been conditional, but seeing it spelled out by a lawyer was still a wound. Yet it also freed me. If love was a contract to be revoked when inconvenient, then perhaps it was not love at all. The escalation did not stop there. Daniel confronted me one afternoon outside the grocery store, his voice low but threatening. "You are making a mistake, Anna," he said, his eyes glinting with rage. "Drop this case or you will regret it!" I stood frozen, clutching the bag of groceries against my aching ribs, and for the first time I looked him straight in the eyes. "I am not afraid of you anymore," I said, though my voice shook. His smirk faltered just for a moment before he stormed off. That small crack in his armor gave me strength. Meanwhile, Officer Reyes reassured me that the evidence was strong. The video from Mrs. Jenkins's camera, the medical reports, my own statement, and soon the testimony of the EMTs who had seen me in pain. It was a solid case. Still, my parents continued their campaign, calling relatives, spreading their version of events, framing me as unstable and vindictive. Some relatives sided with them, sending me messages to stop tearing the family apart. Others stayed silent, too afraid to take a side. Only my Aunt Margaret reached out quietly, telling me she believed me and offering her support. The emotional undulation was relentless moments of hope when I saw allies emerging, followed by plunges of despair when I faced betrayal and isolation. Nights were the hardest, lying awake with pain radiating from my chest, scrolling through Daniel's cruel posts, hearing my mother's voice in my head whispering, "Stay quiet, he has a future." But then I would remember Karen's words, Reyes's steady gaze, Mrs. Jenkins's decision to act, and slowly I began to realize that the future worth protecting was not Daniel's, it was mine. The trial began on a gray Monday morning that seemed to mirror the weight pressing on my chest. My ribs had mostly healed by then, but the memory of the crack still echoed in every anxious breath. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was small, a two-story brick building that usually handled minor disputes and traffic violations, not family scandals that the entire town whispered about. Yet on that day, the benches were full neighbors and acquaintances craning to see the downfall of the Miller family, or perhaps to watch me falter. My parents arrived immaculately dressed, my father in a tailored suit, my mother in a silk blouse, both wearing expressions that blended concern with practiced dignity. They looked like victims of unfortunate circumstances rather than enablers of violence. Daniel entered flanked by his attorney, confident, polished a mask of innocence stretched across his face. He avoided my gaze, but I could feel the heat of his anger radiating from across the room. The prosecution began with the video, the heart of the case. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy footage from Mrs. Jenkins's doorbell camera. The courtroom fell silent as the sounds of shouting filled the air, followed by the crash of impact, and then my cry of pain. The timestamp glowed in the corner, undeniable evidence that contradicted every claim of accident. Gasps rippled through the audience. My mother's face tightened, my father's jaw clenched. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. For once, the truth could not be twisted into something convenient. Next came the testimony of Officer Reyes. He described entering the Miller home, observing my condition, hearing me state directly that Daniel had pushed me. He spoke with calm clarity, unshaken by the defense's attempts to suggest he had misinterpreted. The EMTs followed, detailing the obvious distress I was in and the medical necessity of immediate care. The doctor from the hospital described the fractures in my ribs, the danger of punctured lungs, the unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma. Each layer built upon the last until the narrative of accident collapsed completely. When it was my turn to testify, my hands shook as I raised them to swear the oath. I told the court about that night, about the years leading up to it, about the pattern of favoritism and denial that allowed Daniel's temper to grow unchecked. I spoke of my mother whispering, "Stay quiet. He has a future," words that still haunted me in every quiet moment. My voice wavered, but I did not break. For once, my story was not just shouted into the void, it was recorded, preserved, believed. The defense tried to paint me as jealous, unstable, eager to harm Daniel's reputation. They questioned why I had not left the house immediately, why I had not gone to the hospital the very night of the injury. They tried to twist my hesitation into proof of deceit, but I held firm, explaining that years of gaslighting had taught me to doubt myself, that fear had held me back, but the pain had finally forced me to seek help. The jury listened, their faces intent, their pens moving across notepads. My parents did not testify, but their presence was testimony enough. Their refusal to meet my eyes, their whispered exchanges with Daniel's lawyer, their silence when asked direct questions. They had chosen their side long before the trial began. The closing arguments crystallized the stakes. The prosecutor spoke of accountability, of how protecting an image at the expense of truth only perpetuates harm, of how families should safeguard each other, not break each other. The defense clung to the idea of misunderstanding, of a family argument blown out of proportion, but the evidence was undeniable. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Daniel was found guilty of misdemeanor assault, sentenced to 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management classes, and community service. It was not the maximum penalty, not the prison sentence some might have hoped for, but it was accountability he had never faced before. For the first time in his life, Daniel could not walk away untouched. When the sentence was read, my mother wept, clutching her pearls as though she were the one being punished. My father's face hardened into stone. They looked at me as though I had betrayed them, not as though I had survived something. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, they cornered me. My mother's voice cracked with grief. "Anna, how could you do this to your brother, to us?" My father's words were colder. "From this day forward, you are no daughter of mine." Daniel smirked, even through his defeat, muttering that I would regret everything. In that hallway, surrounded by people staring and whispering, I felt the final severing of ties. They had chosen him again and again, and now they had lost me. And strangely, instead of despair, I felt a strange lightness. The rope that had bound me to their approval had snapped. The emotional undulation of that moment was fierce despair at losing family and relief at gaining freedom all at once. The community reacted swiftly. Some neighbors supported me, praising my courage, while others whispered that I should have kept it private. At the hospital where I worked, some colleagues avoided eye contact, but others quietly squeezed my hand in solidarity. Karen stood by me through every step, reminding me that the measure of family is not blood, but who stands beside you when the storm hits. In the weeks after the verdict, I tried to process the reality. I had stood in court against my brother, my parents, the entire narrative of my childhood. I had been believed. Yet the victory was bittersweet. My parents' final words echoed in my ears, the reality that I was disowned, cut off, erased from their story. But I also knew that silence had cost me too much already. I could not pay that price any longer. Justice had not been perfect, but it had been real. Daniel had been forced to face consequences, however limited. The Miller family's image had cracked, and I, for the first time, had spoken my truth and seen it matter. After the trial, the quiet that settled around me felt almost unnatural, as though my life had been lived inside a storm for so long that stillness itself was foreign. My ribs healed gradually each week, bringing more strength, but the real healing was less visible. Nights were heavy with memories, the sound of the crack, the echo of my mother's whisper, the cold finality of my father's disowning. Yet in the middle of that pain, new roots began to grow. I moved out of Cedar Falls to a small town 30 miles away, where no one introduced me as the Miller daughter. My apartment was modest, but filled with light, the kind that spilled through big windows in the morning and made me believe in the possibility of a new beginning. On my first evening there, I unpacked the notebooks I had hidden for years, those old journals where my poems and stories waited patiently. I placed them on a shelf not as secrets, but as pieces of myself that deserved space. Slowly, I began to write again. What started as personal reflection grew into a blog where I shared my story. At first, it felt terrifying to put words into the world, but messages began to arrive. Women and men wrote that they, too, had been silenced by family, that they had endured bruises hidden behind closed doors, that they had been told to protect reputations at the cost of their own safety. Some of them thanked me for giving them courage. Some simply said they felt less alone. Each message was a thread in a new fabric of belonging, a family not defined by blood, but by shared truth. Karen remained by my side, reminding me to eat on days when writing consumed me, making me laugh when memories threatened to drown me. Aunt Margaret invited me to her home, offering stories of resilience from her own life, teaching me that survival can be passed down like a legacy. These people became my anchors, proof that family could be chosen, cultivated, and nurtured in love rather than demanded in silence. Professionally, I returned to work at the hospital after my leave ended. Walking through those halls again was daunting, knowing some colleagues had absorbed Daniel's lies, but the experience of the trial gave me a new backbone. I spoke firmly when advocating for patients. I recognized signs of abuse more sharply, and I became someone others turned to when they needed courage. My supervisor noticed, and soon I was asked to lead a new initiative on domestic violence awareness. It felt like life had curved unexpectedly, turning my pain into a purpose I never would have chosen but could not ignore. A year after the night Daniel broke my ribs, I was invited to speak at a state conference on domestic violence prevention. The invitation both thrilled and terrified me. The thought of standing before hundreds of people telling my story again made my palms sweat. But deep down, I knew it was the culmination of everything I had endured. I was no longer just Anna the scapegoat or Anna the nurse. I was Anna the survivor, Anna the truth teller. On the morning of the conference, I stood backstage, clutching a small remote that would project slides behind me. My knees shook, but my heart beat steady. When they called my name, I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights washing over me, the crowd rising like a sea of faces waiting. I began with my name, my profession, and then my story. I told them about the dinner, about the shove, about the crack of ribs, and the whisper of silence. I told them about the years of favoritism, the gaslighting, the endless demands to put family image above personal safety, and then I pressed the remote. On the screen appeared the grainy footage from Mrs. Jenkins's doorbell camera. The room grew silent as the sounds played the shouts, the impact my cry. For a moment, it was as though the entire audience held their breath. Then I spoke the words that had lived in my chest for a year. Silence nourishes violence. Truth sets us free. The applause rose slowly at first, then thundered, people standing clapping, some with tears on their cheeks. The sound washed over me like a wave, cleansing, affirming, filling the cracks that years of silence had left inside me. In that moment, I felt lighter than I had ever felt. I was not the daughter my parents disowned. I was not the scapegoat to Daniel's golden child. I was a woman who had chosen to speak, and in speaking had found a larger family, a community bound by truth and resilience. After the talk, people lined up to shake my hand, to hug me, to whisper their own stories. Some pressed notes into my palm, scribbled confessions of pain they had never told anyone else. I carried those notes home and placed them in a box labeled Voices. Each one was a reminder that my story was not an isolated wound, but part of a collective struggle. At home that night, I lit a candle and opened one of my old journals. I read my teenage words filled with longing for freedom, aching for recognition, and I whispered to that younger self, we made it. The scars remained, of course. My parents never reached out, and Daniel served his probation with bitter resentment, occasionally posting venom online. But their absence no longer hollowed me. I had filled the space with people who chose me, who believed me, who valued truth. Healing was not about erasing the past, but about building a future where the past no longer defined me. Sometimes I still dream of that night, the shove, the crack, the whisper. But when I wake, I remind myself of the applause, the standing crowd, the voices I carry in my box. That is the ending. I claim not the silence they demanded, but the truth I declared. And as I close my journal each night, I ask the question I now pose to anyone listening. Have you ever been told to stay silent for the sake of family? If you have, know this: your truth matters. Speaking it may cost you the family you thought you needed, but it can give you a greater one built not on reputation, but on love.